Well, this is the first of the videos I've been thinking about making for a little while. Mentioned before, where I'm just going to start with, just do some reflections on philosophy and things that I found interesting and valuable in looking at it. And so, as a starting point, Socrates is kind of where it all begins. There are people who are called pre-Socratics, that is, people who were before Socrates. Heraclitus is usually mentioned in this sort of first lecture in philosophy, or at the beginning, chapter 1 of a intro philosophy textbook. And he talked about only stepping into a stream once, the same stream, because the water's always flowing. But there's sort of a hand wave to people before Socrates, but Socrates is kind of where it all kind of got going, and we've got good records. And so Socrates lived about 400 BC in Athens. We don't have anything that he wrote, because he didn't write anything much, I don't believe, but Plato was one of his students, and Plato used him as his agent provocateur in his dialogues when he was writing about various things. He used Socrates as a voice, and so we don't know so much about what he actually said. It's hard to untangle them, but apparently at some point when he was reasonably young, I believe, but I'm not exactly sure what age. But the Oracle of Delphi, who was a divine, supposedly divine oracle, was asked who the wisest person in Athens was, and he said that it was Socrates. And Socrates was kind of horrified, and he thought, well, that's rubbish, I don't know anything. Really, there's so much that almost nothing I can say I actually know. So he went about proving the Oracle of Delphi wrong, and went to talk to the great and the good and the wise. And as he talked to them, he kind of realised that they thought they knew what they were talking about, and they would tell him with great confidence the answers to these difficult questions he was pondering. But upon examination, it became apparent to him that they only thought they knew. They clearly didn't know the answers. But where he might be wisest is that at least he knew that he didn't know. And so there's a sort of an epitaph, wisest is he who knows he doesn't know. And so I think as a starting point for me, I was really struggling with finding out, well, trying to work out how I could know if something was true or not. And hearing that there's wisdom in acknowledging that you don't know, and becoming particularly aware that we sort of, when we think about things and what we believe, we tend to say that we think things are true or false, and we might have different levels of certainty. But there's a third state that's very appropriate a lot of the time, and that is I don't know. And often admitting you don't know and saying so to yourself and to others is the beginning of wisdom. And I found that very comforting, actually. He was famous for hanging around in the square in Athens and asking people that might not want to be asked, or buttering people up, at least according to the dialogues that Plato writes. He'd ask someone and sort of give them a bit of praise and say, oh wow, you're so wise and good, why don't you, I don't know anything, how about you help me out here? And so he would bait people, I guess, maybe, into talking to him, and then through a series of questions, the Socratic method, where you just sort of ask a series of questions, he would basically demonstrate that these people really didn't know what they were talking about, and much to their displeasure. And he spent a lifetime doing that, and he wouldn't take a backward step with it, it would seem. And there's a book, one of the first actual philosophy texts that I read rather than introductions. I've got a pile of introductions up here. When I started getting interested, I picked up this from the university bookshop. Not so keen on this one, but I got a pile of these, some of which I've loaned other people actually. But I just read these cover to cover. I probably read 5 or 6 of them before I actually dared to read any philosophy itself. And one of the first, I think, if not the first, was The Last Days of Socrates by Plato. And it starts out with a discussion between Socrates and Euthyphro. And Euthyphro and he were at the court, waiting to go into court. And Euthyphro was somewhat surprised to see Socrates there. And he thought, well, he's unlikely to be bringing charges against someone, given who he was. And so they had a bit of a chat, at least according to Plato, the record. And it turns out that Euthyphro was there pressing charges, and Socrates asked him what the charges were, and he said, well, it's murder. And wow, that's pretty serious. So who is it that you're charging? And he went, well, it's actually my father. And he went, wow, that's pretty full on. And Euthyphro kind of says, well, if things are wrong, they're wrong. It doesn't matter who did them. And he said, well, it must have been someone pretty important that was murdered. He said, well, actually, no, it was a slave, and he ran away, and my father basically had him beaten and thrown in a ditch, and then forgot about him for a week, and when they went back, they found that he was dead. And Socrates says, wow, that's pretty impressive that you've decided to charge on those grounds, a slave and all. And he said, well, like I said, it's if it's wrong, it's wrong. And Socrates said, well, you must be very wise. You must really know what piety is, or what it is to be good, and how to find truth. And he well, I am pretty good actually. And he said, well, I've got no clue. I'm here in all sorts of trouble, and I could do with some help because I'm here on serious charges, the capital offence. I could die as a result of this. So any pointers you could give me would be great. So can you tell me, what's piety? How do I know if something's good? And Euthyphro basically says, well, you just look at what the gods want, and that'll tell you. And that's a deontological position of ethics. You know what is good by what the gods say. Deo being deity, deontological. So basically he said, okay, that's okay, but if we want to, if we've got a dispute about how much something weighs, would we have a war about it, or would we just measure it? Would we weigh it? Euthyphro says, well, of course you just weigh it. And he says, well, if we were wondering how big it was, would we have a war, or would we just measure it? Well, we'd just measure it. So okay, so there's a lot of things that we wouldn't go to war over. They're just easily dealt with. So the sorts of things you might go to war over are deep moral questions. He said, well, I guess that's right, yeah. He said, well, the gods have been at war with each other. Read Homer and you can see that. And you don't doubt those words, do you? And he, well, no, I don't. And he said, well, clearly if they were at war over these things, they were at war because they differed in their idea of what was moral. So it's not good enough to just say what do the gods want, because they don't agree. So this led to what is now called the Euthyphritic dilemma or dichotomy. And basically it boils down to, is something good because the gods love it, or God loves it, or does God love it because it's good? And the dilemma is that if it's good just because God loves it, then anything that God loves the gods love are just by definition good, which means that it doesn't really mean much. But if the gods or God loves an act because it's good, then God is more of a moral guide than actually the arbiter of goodness. So that's an interesting, and I found, when I first read that in my maybe early 20s, I thought that was quite an interesting reflection. There are people that think that that's a false dichotomy, that it's presenting just two positions, and neither of them are correct. There's alternatives between those two, but that's the sort of thing that Socrates did. Now, he went into the court charged with inventing gods and corrupting the youth, and as a result of the years of pestering that he'd done, I think the Senate voted, and basically you put in a white pebble into this bowl if you thought it was innocent, and a black one if they wanted a guilty verdict. And I think that a lot of people probably went in there with only black in their pocket, because they already knew that they wanted to get rid of Socrates because he'd been a pest. He'd embarrassed too many people, and basically they wanted rid of him. He was a nuisance. And it seems like a lot of people thought that if he was found guilty, well, he'd escape. Maybe they didn't want him dead, but they wanted him out of the city. They wanted him away to stop embarrassing them. And so he mounted his own defence, and if you read the defence, he did nothing to help his case. He just offended people again, because that was who he was. Then he was found guilty, but apparently he was offered ways to escape, and people thought he would, I guess. But he said, well, I've lived under the protection of Athens and the Greek state for all my life, and I'm 70 years old now, and why should I, when I've taken advantage of its protection and lived a good life as a result of it, why would I run when it doesn't go my way? So he famously drank hemlock, a poison, with his friends surrounding him, and basically was apparently, at least according to Plato, he was busily encouraging them to say, no, it's not that bad, an old man, and I'll be all right, and this is the right thing to do. So there are famous portraits of the death of Socrates. Yeah, most of what we purportedly know with what Socrates said are dialogues, but they are written by Plato, and Socrates was the character. So there's another thing. So I've had some interesting times recently, and I guess I'm someone that is driven to maybe drink the hemlock when it comes to certain things. I believe that there's certain things that are kind of morally appropriate, and I don't like hypocrisy very much. And over my life, I've many times had all sorts of problems by maybe being a little Socratic and calling out the great and the good, at least foremen and managers and people who basically thought I should do what they say. And I guess at the time when I read about Socrates, and I thought, well, that's a very admirable thing. And I saw that as an encouragement to continue to call out what I saw. But I'm not sure what I think of that anymore. Right at the moment, I've had a few things I've had to deal with, and it does seem that there are some things that are outside of my control and power, and if I continue to call it out, it costs me, and it doesn't change anything. The old the wisdom to know the difference, prayer. Accept what you can't change, and change what you can. And I'm wrestling with that a bit. And there are some issues that I'm dealing with at the moment that I'm kind of wondering, is that the hill I want to die on? Is that something I want to be martyred for? And I think habitually, or just by character, I would have just ploughed in previously. So one thing, I guess, I moved away from Socrates a little bit. There's certainly things that I would like to think that I would be willing to die for. We just went the other day and had a look at an exhibit looking at the Holocaust and people that had put their lives at risk, and some of them paid the ultimate price trying to help Jewish children or Jewish people to escape from the Nazi Holocaust. And I would like to think that I would take those risks, even if it may end up with Gestapo having their way. I'd like to think that I would do that. But there are maybe other things that I've made stands on, and it's made no difference, and it's only cost me, and maybe even just made things a bit worse. So I'm inclined now to be a little bit more circumspect before I go boring straight in and deciding I want to change the world. So that's kind of the summary of Socrates for me. As I said, I think it was the first philosophy text I actually read, and I was able to follow it. And the idea is partly because I'd read the introductions, and they went through some of that stuff. But still very, very interesting person, and number one on my list of people to think to offer a bit of a reflection on. Okay, until next time, bye.